Hello, everyone. Our first panel will explore permitting and regulatory barriers to nuclear deployment and what can be done to create a more predictable and efficient process. Panelists will discuss what's working, what's not, and what can be done to create more pathways to deployment. I'll now turn it over to Victor Ibarra, the Senior Manager for Nuclear Energy at Clean Air Task Force, to introduce the other panelists.
Test. Beautiful. This is on. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's really exciting to see a room full of folks that are interested not just in nuclear energy, but also a very sexy topic in my mind, nuclear regulation as well. I'm joined here by two other colleagues, well-respected friends, and nuclear regulatory experts. I'll start with a quick introduction for my dear friend Adam Stein, who is also a CMU proud Tartan. He's the director of the Nuclear Innovation Program at the Breakthrough Institute, and his focus is on solution-based research in areas related to technology, policy, risk, but also the economics of nuclear energy. So please feel free to follow up with Adam on all topics related to nuclear energy. And to my right, I'm also joined by my colleague, Stephen Burdick, who's actually senior counsel at the Patel Energy Alliance and the M&O contractor for the Idaho National Laboratory, and advises the laboratory on environmental, safety, health, and quality matters, and has done some really well-respected work with other folks that I see in this room on topics related to nuclear regulation and energy. I also want to thank the folks that came before us on the stage who really set up the points of discussions that we're going to be covering today. I would like to begin by emphasizing a couple of things that happened recently a few months ago, and starting off by stating that both President Trump and his administration have recognized the need to promote American energy leadership to protect the United States' economic, national security, and military preparedness by ensuring that an abundant, or in this case, super abundant, supply of reliable energy is readily accessible in every state and territory in the nation. I'm very inspired to be in a room full of folks representing WGA and interested in WGA matters. What I've learned so far is that you are a group of folks that are very well connected, very well prepared to act going into the future, and understanding that nuclear energy is particularly well suited to challenge or to tackle the challenges described, but not just by this administration in meeting the topic of super energy abundance, but also trying to protect and focus on national security initiatives. With all that being said, the effective, efficient, and predictable licensing of new nuclear reactors in the United States is one, no pun intended, critical condition for success in delivering the hundreds to thousands of new nuclear reactors that this administration and future folks want to see in the United States. That being said, I prepared a wide suite of questions, and we will welcome questions at the end as well. But I really do want to emphasize that this discussion that we're going to have on stage and discussion with you is to help the folks involved in WGA understand not just the complexities associated with licensing and permitting a new nuclear reactor in the United States, but also understand what's going on at the federal level in terms of modernizing the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and understand what are complementary actions for you to, as stakeholders involved in the licensing process, to help permit new nuclear reactors in the United States. So to begin with, whichever one of my colleagues would like to take this first question, I want to talk a little bit about what is the actual role the NRC has in licensing a new nuclear reactor, understanding that there is a wide suite of expertise in this room that ranges from nuclear regulatory experts themselves to folks that just are adjacent to nuclear energy and are learning about it. So maybe Adam, we can start with you. What is within the purview of a new licensing application to the NRC, and what's within the scope of regulatory review?
The NRC has authority to license and regulate utilization facilities and production facilities for industrial and commercial use, which is a really fancy way of saying if it uses radionuclides in some way to produce energy for industrial commercial use, then that is under the authority of the NRC. The thing you normally think about with nuclear energy is power plants, but the NRC also has authority for medical isotopes, for instance, and for very small radioactive sources such as tritium in some exit signs that glow because it's radioactive, but emits nothing that would actually affect you, but it's still under the NRC's purview because it uses radioisotopes. Simple as that.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Victor, and thanks, Adam. Great to be on this panel with you, and grateful to the WGA for putting panel one being on this regulatory permitting topic. So appreciate that. Agree with what Adam said. You know, specific to these licenses, you know, certainly there is a safety review that is a big component of that, and maybe we'll talk a little more about, you know, where that is now and where some of the reforms are going. Environmental is another really important piece of those applications and the reviews, and there too, I think there have been really a tremendous amount of environmental reforms already. But we also see the primary agencies here, both DOE and NRC, looking to make more changes in that area. And so I think we'll talk more about that. But two areas that I think sometimes get overlooked from those primary review areas are, one, there's a hearing process associated with licenses under the Atomic Energy Act, you know, issued by the NRC, both a mandatory hearing process that I think there's pretty good consensus that this is unnecessary, and we discussed some of the reasons for that, but and it needs to get removed entirely. Then there's a contested hearing opportunity under the Atomic Energy Act as well. And then just finally, the other area I think sometimes gets overlooked is there are administrative components of these applications. So that could be things like demonstrating technical and financial qualifications by the applicant, looking at things such as foreign ownership control and domination, financial qualification, or I said financial, but decommissioning funding and those types of topics. So it really is a pretty broad look at a bunch of different areas before issuing a license.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. So understanding that the permitting and licensing process at the federal level for new nuclear reactors, specifically commercial power producing reactors, seems to involve a federal action that triggers NEPA, and understanding that there's a safety and environmental review process. What can the panelists on here tell me for the state's role in permitting new nuclear reactors? Can you talk about what's the state's role in citing these type of infrastructure projects? Maybe we can start with you, Adam.
Sure. The state has a very large role in citing energy infrastructure projects. The NRC has to go through the NEPA process because issuing a license is considered a major federal action, but the majority of actual permitting actions are at the state level. Water access, review of environmental impacts also happens at the state level. If it is privately owned land or federal land, which is important, especially in the West, there's a different consideration as well. Historical review of historical landmarks is an important review, as is endangered species. And it's generally the state permitting offices that issue letters to the NRC to use in their own NEPA process, instead of the NRC doing those reviews themselves.
Yeah, I think one thing we wanted to talk about today are, obviously, as the title says for this panel, look at some of the challenges, but also look at some of the ways to overcome those challenges. And with this audience and this subject, this topic is very, very important. And Adam's really nailed some of the different areas. I see in our day-to-day activities here at INL, but look at some of these reactor projects. There's a heavy interaction with state regulation and with state, let's say, environmental permitting and water issues. And so I think the federal permitting reform tends to get a lot of focus, but some of the state permitting reform, it could be just as important. There are past examples of NRC licensing actions where it's the state activities that actually held up the projects. And so I think for a group here that's focused on some of the state activities, really taking some of the same kinds of hard look at the internal state requirements is really important here. And there's a wide variety of these. I think the obvious one, there's a couple of states in the Western Governor Association, footprint that have moratoriums right now on nuclear power. So obviously there's going to be no nuclear plant in those states until that's removed. But we have seen states who have overcome that and have removed those, gone through the legislative process. I think Montana recently did that, and then some states out to the east. So looking for, not just these very extreme ones where there's a moratorium, but really looking at across the requirements and just asking the question, how can we remove these barriers to these projects is really important.
I think that it's important to note for the states looking outwards, really is the developers looking inwards at the states. And if you're a developer, every state has a slightly different process, slightly different set of agencies to talk to. If you want to attract development to your state, bring them together in a place that at least tells the developer what offices you need to talk to, or better yet, bring them all into the same office to have a working group, as some Western states have done. But if I was a developer looking for where I could go build, I would have to figure out every step and every office to talk to in every state so I could determine what the process looks like. And that's just a challenge. It doesn't need to be a challenge. You could just simply put together a list.
Very good point, Shenwan. Thank you for that. Now that we have covered a little bit of what is within the NRC's purview, what's more within a state or local regulator's purview for permitting and licensing these new type of generation projects, I want to shift our conversation a little bit more to talk about the timeliness at hand of licensing and permitting new nuclear reactors, understanding that over the past 5 years, the NRC has undergone an effort mandated congressionally to modernize some of its regulatory processes and practices. So beginning maybe with the good right now, and then we'll shift a little bit more into the challenges that we see facing the NRC. I want to ask our panelists, what are some of the efforts that you've seen that have led to more effective licensing at the NRC, understanding that we currently have new non-light water reactor designs that have received some sort of regulatory approval to construct their reactor designs. Examples are the Kairos Power's Hermes reactor and the Abilene Christian University Next Lab and their reactor in Texas. So understanding that, can either of you speak to that topic? Maybe we'll start with you this time, Steve.
Yeah, happy to talk to that. So, maybe the question is, why am I up here in the first place? Certainly my role at INL, factors into looking at licensing and permitting reform. I've been here at INL for about coming up on 7 years, so 6.5 years. Before that, I spent about 15 years at a law firm in DC in its nuclear energy practice. And so really just representing clients before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It predated Commissioner Crowell's time. I don't think I've ever appeared before him, but worked on a lot of the projects that were in the last wave of NRC applications, so in the 2000s and 2010. So when this subject matter comes up, that I start thinking back and comparing those days to current days. And you mentioned, Victor, the timeframes, and we host some programs for investors in nuclear, and one thing I show them is a graph of the timeframes it takes from application submission until the NRC has issued a license. And if you go back to those early 2000s, mid 2000s, it started off with some pretty promising, I think, results. There were a couple projects with early site permits, kind of pre-approving a site, that took about 3 years or so to issue those permits. Reasonable, given that we had not used these regulations before. Then you fast forward a little bit, a number of additional years, and the NRC issued its first combined licenses, or COLs. These are really a big deal because they both authorize construction and operation of a reactor. Well, the first couple of those, so the first two of those were issued about, I think it was 42 months or so, about 4 years once everything was together. So again, that didn't feel too bad. But then you look at the ones that came after that, and I think this is what people reflect on. It was 6, 7, 8, 9 years, kind of in the mid 2010s, for issuing a lot of those. And so then you fast forward to kind of the current time frame that Victor's talking about. it's not quite a apples to apples comparison because they're different types of licenses. But you've had the NRC issue some construction permits in 2 years or 18 months, and the schedule for some of those are that. So that was one message as I was thinking of the panel today, I wanted to share is really cautiously optimistic about those improvements and just that here's whether Adam and Victor agree with this. But there have been some very important improvements since the 2000s and 2010s that have drastically improved that licensing. So cautiously optimistic, but there's more to do. And we heard from Commissioner Crowell, some of the things that the NRC is working on, DOE's got some activities. Those have to still be implemented to get to really the final point. But it seems to be moving in that direction. And so I think there is a level of optimism there. Thoughts?
I agree with a lot of what Steve said, but there's a lot of maybe a little bit more hesitance on my part because I dig through the data. The construction permits that were issued recently for advanced reactors were issued in a timely manner. That is a positive step forward. They were also research or test reactors, which under the Atomic Energy Act are subject to the minimum necessary regulations. Commercial reactors with a full commercial license to operate for the power grid have more regulations, a different set of regulations. They're not automatically exempt from certain regulations. They're also expected to last 40 years instead of 2 or 3 years, or maybe 10 years, depending on which construction permit we were talking about. But there have been steps forward, but it's not to the point where we are actually reducing the barriers, the things that are actually in the regulations that are slowing the old things down. We're getting rid of a lot of the procedural inefficiencies. That is awesome. But we're not addressing the actual bumps in the road that led to those efficiencies in the first place yet, and we still need to do that. Until about 2 months ago, the generic timeline for licensing a new light water reactor, the kind that the NRC has licensed for about 50 years, was on the website as being 42 months. Now, after the executive order, it's 18 months. Licensing, the safety review, that hasn't changed. What else has changed? Proceduralism, mostly. It's not that we had to take 42 months for these things, it's that we did take 42 months for these things. So the NRC is doing better, can get better, but something needs to fundamentally change to make this permanent, to make it not just a resurgence, but something that sticks this time.
And I really appreciate you diving into that, Adam, because I think that sets us up well for my next question, which is, while the NRC has shown progress, there are obviously still opportunities for reform and improvement. So to the both of you, gentlemen, what changes are within the scope of the commission? You know, Adam, you spent time talking about procedures, right? But what else outside of that, maybe within legislative authority, would be within the interest of new nuclear deployment, the safe, effective deployment of new nuclear in the United States? We'll start again with you, Steve.
Yeah, I can get started here. We've done some thinking about this, and with INL and coordinating with DOE, and going back a couple of years, we were asked by the House Energy and Commerce Committee to provide this very input of how can we improve some of this, and the Congress was looking towards the ADVANCE Act, and so we published a paper in 2023 on this topic, and so I was one of the authors with Dr. Wagner and Dr. Jean. It looks like they're not here anymore, so they can't defend themselves. Like some flexibility here. But then fast forward to this past, since the beginning of the year, and the administration change, we were asked the same question. Some of our past recommendations have been addressed by the ADVANCE Act, and then it was, there was a lot of momentum here. This predated the executive orders, but there was still a lot going on, and so they asked an update, and so we issued an update in April on this topic. But it looks at both legislative changes and then things that the agencies can do directly, and so. We've talked about a couple of them, but we looked at legislative changes. There are things like right now, the Atomic Energy Act limits licenses to 40 years. Like, why can't that be extended? I very rarely hear anyone say, we're just going to operate this for 40 years. And some of the purposes for the 40-year license are gone. So that could be a legislative change to provide some more certainty in these investments. Mandatory hearings, I brought that up earlier. This is a hearing that is required by the statute, by the Atomic Energy Act, but it's a hearing that's uncontested. So the only participants in this hearing are the NRC staff, who has reviewed the application and is ready to approve it, the applicant, who obviously supports the application, and then either the commission or sometimes it can delegate to their Atomic Safety and Licensing Board to oversee it. But it's not a contested hearing. It becomes more like a public meeting. There's really good consensus, I think, from the agency, from comments, the industry, the NRC staff in the past have testified, that we really don't need this. So this is a great prime example, low-hanging fruit, where Congress could just get rid of this and there would be no detriment to the things we've talked about. So lots of examples like that. We've seen a lot of NEPA reform already. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. And so some great progress in there. I'll stop there with NEPA. I think we may talk a little more, but we recommended some changes to the review standard. Adam mentioned one about the, for research reactors, could you take something like that and apply it to some of these very safe, smaller reactors? And then even a process where after the NRC licenses the first of a particular type of reactor, they then use their rulemaking process to issue general licenses where an applicant wouldn't have to apply for these, but could, as long as they met certain criteria reviewed by the NRC, they would automatically have a license. And once you start talking about those, you're talking about some of the real changes. I think, Adam, maybe what you were getting at earlier, to really change how these things are reviewed, but still in a safe manner, because you would still have that backstop initial safety review. And we heard about standardization earlier. That's going to be really key to this.
Absolutely. Adam, I know you and your team spend a lot of time thinking about this. Anything you'd like to add to Stephen's comments?
One is standardization. Right now in the regulation, a standard design is considered an identical design. But we don't necessarily want an identical design. We want to learn from the first design and make small changes, keeping the core components the same. So if the characteristics of the reactor are all the same and safety profile is the same, why can't we change, this is just hyperbole, the color on the outside of the building? Technically, if you didn't do that, it wouldn't be identical. And that kind of terminology limits just innovation. Without getting to the core of what we really want to be identical is the safety profile. So we can then go and say, this safety system, it's identical, change where the scaffolding is change where the lifting rig is in the turbo deck. Who cares? That doesn't change the safety of the system. But the regulation says identical. So let's fix that kind of speed bump. Some things are just pulled forward from the past when the NRC modernizes. One example that I usually bring up is population density requirements. The NRC issued new guidance on this, but the new guidance would consider 1/6, 1 out of every 6 of operating plants to be ineligible for being suitable to build a brand new reactor on. Just because of the exact thing that this conference wants to enable, which is superabundance. Prosperous communities that attracted more investment and build a larger community, they're now over the population density requirement. That, in my view, should be addressed. It should be written so if an operating reactor is licensed by the NRC, clearly that site is suitable for an operating reactor. But that assumption was just pulled forward from the past. And one other I'm going to mention is just in terms of things that can get better is just the efficiency of the NRC process to review the policy. There's a lot of policy that needs to be reviewed. In fact, the executive order required a complete review and reform of regulations in 9 months. So proposed rules need to be out sometime in February. That's very rapid for a rulemaking process to review the entire paradigm of regulations. But in the last 6 years since the Nuclear Energy and Innovation and Modernization Act, just the commission vote process, and I swear I'm not trying to pick on Commissioner Kroll, but the commission vote process was on average 236 days to get to a vote, issue response back to the staff. So almost 3/4 of a year That's not rapid innovation.
Thank you for that, Adam. We've brought up topics about what's within the NRC's purview from an organization standpoint. What are maybe recommendations you would give, Congress if they want to empower the NRC to be put in a position to license safe new nuclear reactors in the United States? But one thing to contextualize as well, right? I didn't talk too much about myself, even though I love it, but I was actually a former federal employee before starting here at Clean Air Task Force. I worked in the Office of Energy Market Regulation at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Wonderful time, but since I have left, a lot of my colleagues have left FERC as well. There's been conversations about the impact and reductions in force at key federal agencies, examples including the one I just provided about FERC, but also at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So, gentlemen, understanding that we've talked about what you would like to see potentially from the commission, how do we contextualize some of these reductions in forces, and what would you recommend the NRC prioritize with the staffing, understanding there's just pressure from external forces on the NRC to do things like a wholesale review of other rulemakings, right, within a 9-month period?
So the NRC does not have staff to do that wholesale review effectively, simply because they didn't have the staff in those offices to begin with. They were trying to iterate one step at a time to review their regulations. Doing it all at once is a huge task for any agency. I don't want to I want to underline that. That's a big ask. And if they were not doing that, just for the licensing, if we get to 300 additional gigawatts of nuclear power, which is in the executive order, 400 gigawatts of power by 2050. In 2050, even if the NRC is twice as efficient in staff hours for review, they're going to need roughly 800 employees in their licensing office. That's a lot of employees in just the licensing office. And this is just one arm of the NRC. The NRC needs to start to retain some of that new, fresh talent now, so they are trained when the industry wants to apply. Because the industry wants their application to be docketed as soon as it's submitted, not in a queue, which is what the NRC has done for, say, license renewals, and the industry pushed back on that. The NRC was trying to reduce overall costs by staggering them so they can keep the workforce at the level that would sustain that, instead of overhiring and then having to charge additional fees in terms of staffing. But the NRC needs to increase its workforce now, not reduce it. It needs to increase it with the appropriate people in the appropriate positions, but it's having a hard time doing that at the level of retirement as it was, and it definitely needs to increase now.
Very well put.
Yeah, I don't have much to add there. I agree with what Adam's saying. It's all about getting the right people, right number of people in the right place, the right time. But I think there is a component here that falls to the applicants and to the industry as well, that they need to have kind of a realistic discussion with the NRC and also DOE as well, about what projects are really happening and what are the realistic timeframes. Because this is a really tough, moving target to hit, and there were some real challenges in the 2000s and 2010s with some of that, where it seemed like there were going to be a lot of activity, and then there wasn't as much. There was some, but and so that can be a real challenge with federal hiring.
Yeah, absolutely, and we've talked about this a little bit today in previous conversations, and we've alluded to this in this conversation as well. But over the next several years, we do expect to see companies make strides in development of their technology, but also partnerships with key organizations, including the national laboratories. INL is a prime example of that, as they continue to develop and demonstrate their nuclear reactor technologies. Stephen, maybe this is a little bit more directed towards you, right?
Sure.
But understanding this expectation, what can labs and the NRC do to maximize learnings while still emphasizing an independent review from NRC in the future for NRC, for lack of a better word, authorized reactors?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that going on, and we've heard that in some of the remarks earlier with that interface between DOE and NRC. DOE and NRC have a number of memoranda of understanding that are there to support this. And some of this came about from some of the legislation directed. Some of it was just made a lot of sense that they are working in some of the same areas and need to share information, codes and standards, all of that. From my kind of outside perspective, since I'm not in the middle of these reviews, but I've definitely seen what looks like to be a lot more interaction between the agencies, and I think that's very promising. And looking forward to these executive orders and implementation, I think that's really going to be necessary. And as we look to even, there's been discussion of transition from an R&D DOE authorized project on, let's say, a national lab or another site, and then transitioning that into an NRC licensed commercial project. That's going to have to happen anymore. And I think really need the agencies to be, sharing as much information and being involved together in some of these activities will be key.
Thank you. You have any comments?
It's not just DOE, it's also DOD now.
Exactly.
That's important too. In a recent hearing in front of the Senate, Chairman Wright mentioned that the NRC is working on a MOU with DOD right now. So I hope that those agencies improve relationships to work together on this as well.
Very well put, gentlemen. Thank you so much for that. On this topic of the expectation for licensees or potential licensees, right, applicants to submit either a construction permit application, subsequently an operating license application, or a combined operating license application. The NRC is expected to meet some sort of licensing timeline, but they also need support from industry to submit high quality applications. What can industry do to make sure that they meet these high quality applications to ensure timely review of new nuclear reactor applications? But also, how can we, right, the folks in this room, support them?
Yeah, I can talk to this. I mean, this obviously is a key point. It's a two-way street. You can only expect the agency to review something timely fashion if you give them something quality that meets the agreed upon requirements. And I think in the past we've almost seen it go the other direction, that you have an applicant wants to do a project. Well, they're going to first look at, well, what was the application that was last successful for this? And so they'll take that and they'll say, well, I can do better than that. So they'll add some requirements and then obviously back and forth. And so you get this kind of continuous increasing of information. With reg reform, you're really cutting away from that. And I think maybe to answer your question, the key part is that communication between the applicants and the NRC. And I think a lot of that's happening through these reg reform discussions, but it also has to happen on a case by case, having that pre-application engagement as to, particularly if the company wants to do something, new or novel or aggressive, then having that discussion with the NRC is really important.
Absolutely. I guess we definitely just want to discourage copying, pasting a license application where you keep the old application name in that new application. We don't want to see any of that, right?
Unless it's a 10th of a kind and you already have design certification, in which case you would hope that it would be consistent from something that was already approved. But in terms of, Steve mentioned pre-application. Pre-application is not required, but the NRC strongly encourages it. So the NRC and the applicant can get together and figure out what they will both agree upon as being the content of an application. The past, if you put too much in an application, that becomes a problem. Part of the problem at Vogel was things were built slightly out of tolerance of what was in the application. So the applicant submitted it, the NRC approved it, the spacing of rebar, for instance, was slightly off, and the NRC said this doesn't meet your spec that you submitted and we approved, which was true. So they had to dig it out and start over again, because they put too much detail, more detail than the NRC actually needed in the application. Then it became on the docket. So some developers have intentionally tried to remove as much as they could from the application. So there's less to trip you up later. And then the NRC says, sometimes very appropriately, there isn't enough here for us to review. So the challenge is with new technologies, there is no advanced reactor licensing pathway. We have existing frameworks. We license through exemption. Most developers have to say we should be exempt from this because it literally doesn't relate to our design. And we have to justify that to the NRC. So every application is a one-off bespoke application for that developer right now, as the NRC and the applicant try to come to an agreement, and they don't always agree. That's part of the issue with what is a high-quality application and what is a low-quality application is in the perception of both parties. The developer might think this is plenty of information to meet the regulations, and the NRC might disagree. It's not always that this is clear whether the developer's failing or not, but sometimes it is.
Thank you for that, gentlemen. One thing that I like asking folks in the room, but I'll let the first two folks here answer this, is there's been external factors put onto or forces put onto the NRC to move forward with the effective, efficient, and safe licensing of new nuclear reactors. In my opinion, the NRC's independence has been seen as a key as ensuring public trust in the safety of nuclear power plants. So to those in the room, but also to those on the stage, is there a concern that the rapid pace of change and political action of the administration are threatening anything like a social license for new nuclear power in the United States or even existing nuclear power in the United States?
There is concern by many people that is happening, that the NRC is no longer independent. In my view, the NRC needs to be independent. The Atomic Energy Act passed its authority on to the NRC through the Energy Reorganization Act. This is in statute. The commission shall issue licenses for industrial and commercial utilization and production facilities. It's the commission, not even the NRC, it's the commission that makes that decision. And they need to be able to do so. They need to modernize regulation as they've been mandated by Congress and a few acts now, but it's still the commission that has to make that decision.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on this topic. I will say, just from my perspective, and it helps me get comfortable with what's going on, as I look around the people I interact with, some of my friends at the NRC, I see statements from the different agencies. They're all very focused on safety and maintaining that safety, and so I think that gives me some comfort in some of these topics that I feel like it's understood and people are living that way. And I think if you get past that, where people are doing that, then I think that's the sign that we need to look at doing things different ways. Absolutely.
If I may add, there's concern from the other side too, that the NRC is doing its own thing and that it's being too independent from what the nation needs. And there's different layers of independence here. The commission is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. So the commission has always been, in some senses, political. And there's a reason that you can only have 3 commissioners from any individual party for that reason. But then below that is another layer of independence. The staff works on the safety and environmental reviews and the security reviews independently of the commission, and they make the recommendations up to the commission. So you have several different layers of independence here, and those provide these independent checks and balances on the way up before a license is issued to help ensure that the mandate of the NRC is maintained.
Well put. Thank you so much. Looks like we are transitioning now into Q&A. Happy to hear all comments and thoughts. I see hands are already very, very well raised. A lot of hands very well raised.
Start on the other.
Sorry, Adam, did you want to say one more thing?
I didn't get to say my favorite thing the NRC has done to modernize lately, and that is the one that Commissioner Kroll brought up, which is changing the NRC's mission. I think that is the most important thing that will drive change at the NRC from here forward, to enable the use of nuclear technologies for the benefit of society.
Yeah, Victor, I didn't get a comment on this slide here. Did anyone look at this the slide and think they were at the wrong panel? Victor, you and I need to update some
pictures. Looks like we have a question back here, though.
Yeah, and bravo for the beard. Wonderful. This is a question, especially given this audience, and it's a question of geography. In the Region 4, right, the closest NRC office is in Texas. And this is an honest question that I'd love your perspective on. In the way that the NRC is changing, do you feel that there is a disadvantage for states in both deployment and for companies that are manufacturers through a number of different, applications within the nuclear space? Do you think that, especially in Idaho or Utah or Washington or Wyoming, that there is a disadvantage for not having a NRC office in this region?
I mean, it's a good comment. I haven't thought too hard about this. A lot of the licensing and permitting activities come from the NRC headquarters, and so there's probably a pretty level playing field there. I think where for the projects we're talking about, where it could get a little more interesting is during construction and very significant construction, and we saw with in the 2010s as we were moving into construction for the VC Summer project and the Vogel project in the Southeast, a lot of that construction oversight was directed towards Region 2, and it was close by them. So I'm probably not the right person to ask, but I wonder if we do see a lot of construction, if we could see some movement on, where that responsibility is assigned. Certainly there's some flexibility, legally to do that if needed. Yeah. Yeah, but good comment.
Yeah, I agree with Steve here. The primary roles of the regions is to support construction and operations. Let's build 100 reactors in the West and make a new office.
I wanted to ask about, most of the current projects are skipping over early site permits or design certifications. For states that aren't likely to be first mover states, is there still a role for early site permits for sites that are good candidates, but no one's ready to make the investment decision?
I'm very glad you brought that up because that's one of my favorite topics about licensing. Early site permits are excellent for states and communities to drive investment and construction into areas that you want. Right now, for instance, if a developer came to your state, they would think about where they might want to build a plant. That might not be the same thing as policy goals for the state. You might want to redevelop a former coal site. You might want to drive a lot of industrial building in one location because a new manufacturer is going to be there and it's easier to put the power behind the meter instead of with transmission construction. ESPs offer states, in addition to developers, an opportunity to pre-license a specific site with an envelope of how large of a reactor you would put on that site. So you don't have to be design specific. You can just say, I want to build a reactor that's 1,000 megawatts on this site and get that site approved for that action. So in 2 or 3 years, when developers are looking for where they should build, you now have the most advantageous site for them. You are helping guide where this will go ahead of time. And you're speeding up the process too, because if they're coming in with a previously licensed or constructed somewhere else design, then it's almost a copy and paste. You're copying the safety analysis from a different site where they already built the design. You already have the environmental review for the site level review. As long as those match up, then the review process for the NRC is, I don't want to say trivial, but much, much less.
Yeah, I'll add, I completely agree. I love this idea. I think there's a lot of potential there with early site permits, and they are under the NRC's rules, they're transferable. And so there's even the process in there that a state or another entity could pursue, get the early site permit, and then there's an existing process to transfer that to the company that then would be utilizing that to support their construction and operation. One challenge that's been in the past, like other things we've talked about, is the early site permits have been pretty expensive to get. But I think with the reg reform, with things like the NRC has prepared I think it's still a draft, generic environmental impact statement. Like there's a lot of efforts that could make that much cheaper, much more streamlined. And once you kind of get all those things together, it should be a much easier process.
And agreeing with everything said on this stage so far, but ultimately, Ian, a tool that can guarantee some sort of regulatory certainty. This doesn't necessarily lead to shovels in the ground, but in the example I would provide here, right, the Clinch River nuclear site, which is expected to host at least one BWRX 300 design by TVA in the near future, is leveraging an early site permit that was applied to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission a few years ago, or not too long ago. Just a data point.
Paul Hughes, state of Kansas. On the topic of the social permit, if you will, for a facility and improving the way that states interact with feds on a developer project like this, my question is about how states can update their own regulations and their own emergency response plans when the designs are changing and the rules are changing.
Very great question. One starting point maybe then Steve and Adam to take over is understanding that as advances in nuclear technologies allow us to consider different types of moderators, coolants, fuel types, smaller reactors, including small modular and even microreactors, may have a small or even no environmental impact, and that can allow us then to reimagine how we proceed with safety. We've alluded to things like the draft GEIS rulemaking, but there's also other processes at the NRC, like the non-power utilization rulemaking that they're working on at the moment to understand how we can talk about or have conversations about citing low consequence or reactors that might have smaller consequences than your traditional large 1 gigawatt size facilities that inherently have a lot of nuclear material that you're dealing with. So that is the starting point. There are processes that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that staff are currently going and working through to ensure that we have the proper protocols in the future to move this forward, but these are still impending rulemakings that we expect to see more work on in the future. But I'll let the other gentleman on the panel speak as well.
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge. I think for a lot of these areas, we're kind of in the period of uncertainty, or I wanted to say chaos, but that's not the right word. Like there's a lot of kind of tearing down regulations and then building them back up, putting them in the right kind of frame. And so there's going to be movement, I think, in all of these areas. But I think things like this workshop and communication with the regulators, with the laboratory, with experts, that's really all you can do, is just trying to get the most up-to-date information and try to move along, in that same period.
You specifically mentioned emergency planning. I've done a lot of research on that. Some of the new designs are going to have site level or site boundary emergency planning zones, which means that they would not have to have any off-site planning or exclusionary boundaries or whatnot. The states ultimately make the decisions on what to do off-site in emergencies. So states may choose to pursue different approaches than the NRC will. However, it's more important to have a plan than anything else. Having an appropriate plan is what will make things function in an emergency more so than having specific requirements. Pre-planning is great. Having a plan to how to execute is always the number one thing for any emergency, not just a nuclear power facility, but chemical facility, any other power generation facility, a garment factory. Everybody should have some sort of offsite emergency plan so emergency first responders know how to respond to that. The NRC did a rulemaking on this starting in 2019, so it's actually finalized at this point. And their emergency response team, in my experience at least, is very welcoming to talk to states about how the regulations are different, how they can work together with states that may have experience with a 10-mile EPZ, may have zero experience with a nuclear plant in their state at all. But I have found them to be very welcoming to discussions for states.
The last thing I would want to mention on this topic is that there's also been discussions about, creating offices within the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, understanding that they are these type of questions that you have yourself about what is the best way for folks to get involved or states to get involved and prepare for these type of situations. There's even been legislation introduced in the past on what would an office of public participation at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission look like, right? Because sometimes it's not very, I think, conducive to just navigate the NRC's website. No shade, Commissioner Crow. Exactly. You heard it here first. But these are questions that are very, very important, and we want to make sure that stakeholders like yourselves, right, can have this information readily available.
INL, pardon?
Go ahead.
About the ability of the INL to test to 3 by next July, and that was pretty ambitious. I don't know who gave him that script, but it was very ambitious. In that conversation, is it your belief that a long time ago, before it was the INL, before it was the INEL, it was a nuclear reactor testing station? And one of the things the congressman said was, he said, I'm a dentist, I'm not a nuclear physicist. He said, how do I know what to support, what's a good one, what's a bad one? If the INL were an NRTS, couldn't it test all of the plethora of new models that are going to come forward?
Yeah, I'll be a little careful here since I work for the M&O contractor, not DOE, but I totally agree. I think we are getting back to our roots of the National Reactor Testing Station, and there have been 52 reactors that have been constructed and operated on the INL site. So I think we're getting back to that, and I totally agree. I think there is the capability, certainly the space on 890 square miles to do so, and the support network can be built up to support that. So I feel like, and again, it's just my observations, with DOE, looking at some of their requests for application, they've been very inclusive of, supporting, all different types of reactors. So, I'd love to see as many reactors here as possible. And I think Dr. Wagner and the rest of INL.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because in that spirit, hypothetically, if I had a small micro and I needed about 5 acres to put on the INL to test it, would you be open to that idea?
Yeah, I think, that's certainly, the discussions that we have, and we work with a lot of companies that need, whether it's 5 or 20 acres to do projects on the site. And again, with this kind of, fundamental mission of the INL to perform these research and development experiments to be able to show that these projects work before they get to the commercial stage.
Sure that even that testing is done. Not sure if you have any questions.
The question was about the 3 reactors by next year slightly, and I'll just mention that that's
11.
Well, in the executive order it said 3 by next 4th of July. There were 11 reactor designs accepted into that program. Those are not commercial plants. They're not intended to be. They're supposed to be research and demonstration plants, which INL has exceeded at in the past. If you wanted to build the next AP 1000 here, it probably would be a bad site for it. And the governors mentioned why earlier, water. You don't have access to huge water supplies to cool it, to then run it for operations. This is just, every site isn't the best site for every technology, which is part of the reason there are many different technologies.
Very well put. I see one more hand. Do we have more? Oh, so sorry. I apologize, but we'll come up to you right after this to make sure that, well, thank you all for having us today. Thanks for the panelists. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.